They say that before they fell in love, they signed a contract. People tell stories of convenient arrangements transforming into storybook romances, of grand emotional declarations echoing through cavernous estate halls. But my reality was not a fable. Mine was quiet, like a held breath that no one dared to release. We were enemies who shook hands over a wedding altar, trading solemn vows, like hostile corporate takeovers. There was no sweeping music, no sudden warmth, and certainly no illusion of a shared happily ever after. The corporate boardroom smelled of ozone, stale espresso, and the sharp, clinical scent of freshly printed legal paper. Outside the floor-to-ceiling glass windows, a heavy Pacific Northwest rainstorm battered the city. The relentless droplets blurred the gray skyline into a washed-out, melancholy watercolor. The storm felt entirely appropriate for the occasion. It was a cold, unrelenting force of nature, much like the man sitting motionless across the long expanse of polished marble. Julian Thorne did not fidget. He was not merely a wealthy businessman. He was my fiercest architectural rival. To the press and the public, the billionaire was a modern visionary, a man who designed impossible structures that defied gravity and sentiment in equal measure. To me, he was a wall of impenetrable winter stone. He wore a dark, meticulously tailored suit that seemed to absorb the dim fluorescent light of the room. His posture was perfectly rigid, his large hands resting flat on the table, projecting an aura of absolute, terrifying control. I analyzed the physical distance between us, exactly 12 feet of sterile marble, and wondered if it was possible to feel so profoundly isolated while sitting in a room full of corporate attorneys. The legal teams buzzed around us like nervous insects, shuffling thick documents and adjusting their silk ties. Neither Julian nor I acknowledged their presence. We were too busy analyzing each other, silently calculating the structural integrity of the person sitting across the table. Choices vanish quickly when you are poor, when your mother is dying, and when your father leaves behind more debt than memories. That was another phrase people used, though my father was not dead. He had simply vanished. My mother had spent her final months in a sterile hospital room, watching the medical monitors count down her remaining breaths. When she passed, my father did not grieve. He gambled. He chased reckless investments, attempting to build impossible residential towers that the city bedrock could not support. When the banks finally called his massive loans, he quietly boarded a flight to nowhere. He left Vance's architecture bleeding out from predatory interest rates and a spectacularly collapsed international project. Julian's empire, Thorne Industries, was facing its own structural failure. A hostile takeover loomed from a board of directors who demanded conservative stability after a disastrous fiscal quarter. They wanted him married to secure his public image. I wanted my firm saved from total liquidation. We were two sinking ships anchored in the same dark ocean, deciding to lash our hulls together to survive the rising tide. A junior attorney, with trembling hands, slid the thick, leather-bound folder across the marble. The marriage contract. It was 50 pages of dense legalese, outlining the precise boundaries of our lives, our financial assets, and our mandated public appearances. There was no mention of affection. There were no clauses regarding warmth or domestic comfort. It was a flawless blueprint for a completely sterile existence. I reached into my battered leather briefcase and withdrew my blue ink fountain pen. It was a heavy silver instrument with a worn nib, an antique I had used to trace every delicate hand-drawn blueprint of my career. The cold metal felt deeply grounding against my palm. It was the only object I possessed that still carried a sense of dignity, a reminder that I was a highly competent artisan, not just a piece of collateral. I unscrewed the cap, the metallic click echoing sharply in the heavy silence of the room. I did not look at the hovering attorneys. I looked directly at my rival. "The indemnity clause on page 42, I said, my voice perfectly steady, refusing to betray the frantic, erratic beating of my heart. "It leaves the spatial margins of my design department completely vulnerable to your board's oversight. I am agreeing to a corporate merger, Julian. I am not agreeing to an acquisition." Julian did not blink. His dark eyes locked onto mine, entirely devoid of any visible heat, anger, or condescension. "Your design department has been structurally unsound for 6 months, Clara," he replied. His voice was a low, resonant hum that vibrated gently against the cold glass windows. I am reinforcing the foundation. I have no interest in dismantling your life's work. If I wanted to acquire you, I would have simply let the bank foreclose on your properties tomorrow morning. His words were sharp, clinical, and devastatingly true. There was no immature bickering between us, no loud raising of voices or dramatic posturing. Our rivalry had always been an intellectual warfare, fought strictly in the margins of drafts and the silent corners of zoning committee meetings. He respected my competence enough not to lie to me, and I respected his ruthless pragmatism enough to know he was absolutely right. I lowered my gaze back to the heavy parchment. The typed words blurred together, a meaningless sea of clauses and stipulations that effectively erased my independence. I pressed the silver nib to the signature line. I pressed too hard. The delicate nib bled slightly, a dark indigo stain pooling unevenly at the tail end of my name. It was a minor imperfection, an uncharacteristic loss of control from a woman who prided herself on drawing perfectly straight lines without a ruler. The paper absorbed the excess ink, permanently capturing the exact weight of my quiet reluctance. I exhaled slowly, pulling the pen away from the document. When I looked up, Julian's gaze was not on my face. His dark eyes were fixed entirely on my hand. He tracked the pressure of my grip, his expression unreadable, analyzing the heavy stroke with the same quiet intensity he applied to studying my rival blueprints. He noticed the slight tremor in my fingers, the white-knuckled tension holding the silver barrel. He noticed the exact moment my defensive armor cracked, just a fraction of an inch. But the stoic architect did not offer a hollow word of comfort, nor did he smile in victory. He simply reached into his own jacket, withdrew a black carbon pen, and signed his name beside mine, with a flawless, unyielding stroke. The lawyers swiftly gathered the documents, murmuring their practiced, hollow congratulations. The sound was abrasive, like static cutting through a beautiful, melancholic symphony. Julian stood, smoothly buttoning his tailored suit jacket. He did not offer me his arm. We had successfully secured our respective empires, but we had traded our personal freedom for a piece of paper. "My driver will take you to the estate," the billionaire said, his tone completely devoid of inflection. "I will arrive after the evening board meeting concludes." "I can drive myself," I replied, carefully capping my pen and slipping it back into the worn leather case. "You can," Julian agreed softly, pausing near the heavy oak door. "But the roads along the coast are slick tonight, and your tires are badly worn." "Allow me to provide the transport, Clara. The contract is signed. You do not need to fight me for the right to arrive safely." He stepped out into the hallway, the heavy door clicking shut behind him. He left me alone, with the quiet hum of the building's ventilation and the relentless drumming of the rain against the glass. I stood by the window for a long time, watching his black car pull away into the dark storm. I crossed my arms over my chest, wondering how I was going to survive a lifetime tethered to a man who saw every hidden crack in my foundation. The drive along the coast that evening was treacherous, a winding ribbon of wet asphalt hugging the sheer drop to the deep ocean. I sat in the back of his luxurious town car, watching the heavy rain beat relentlessly against the fogged glass. The vehicle's heater hummed a low, steadied drone, offering a physical warmth that felt entirely clinical and unearned. I pressed my palm to the cold window, feeling the deep vibration of the road beneath the heavy tires. I was leaving the familiar city where I had built my name, heading toward a coastal fortress designed by the man who had spent the last 5 years trying to tear my professional reputation apart. 2 days passed before the reality of our arrangement took physical shape. The transition from my small, cramped city apartment to Julian's coastal stone mansion in the rugged cliffs of the Pacific Northwest felt like crossing an invisible boundary into another world. The massive estate was a formidable fortress of dark stone, expansive glass, and ancient, heavy timber. It did not smell of ostentatious wealth or generic luxury. It smelled of wild salt spray, cold earth, and the deep, grounding scent of cedarwood. There were no grand welcoming parties waiting for me, no household staff lining the halls to greet the new bride. There was only profound silence. It was an isolation so deep and absolute that it felt almost heavy, pressing firmly against my shoulders. As I wandered through the cavernous, dimly lit hallways, I had packed my simple clothes, my thick architectural textbooks, and my personal drafting supplies. I had brought absolutely nothing else, stubbornly refusing to let his sprawling wealth consume the small, resilient pieces of my own identity. On the third morning, we officially established our shared workspace. Julian had directed his sparse staff to convert the drafty, west-facing library into a dual architectural studio. The room was massive, lined from floor to ceiling with thousands of heavy, leather-bound volumes on structural engineering and classical design. It featured a spectacular bay window that overlooked the churning gray ocean, the thick glass vibrating faintly with the sheer force of the incoming tide. The air inside was perpetually chilled, the ancient stone walls completely resisting the ambient heat of the modern cast-iron radiators. In the exact center of the room sat his massive cedarwood drafting table. It was a beautiful, rustic piece of furniture, deeply scarred by years of sharp carbon blades and heavy compass points, smelling faintly of wood shavings and old paper. When I entered the library carrying my own collapsible desk, Julian looked up from his scattered sketches. He did not say a single word. He simply gestured with his pencil to the empty space directly opposite his workspace. My desk was an old, scarred piece of mahogany I had personally salvaged from my father's defunct office years ago. It groaned under its own weight as I locked the heavy brass hinges into place. It was a rather pathetic sight compared to the imposing grandeur of Julian's setup, but it was mine. I carefully arranged my carbon pencils, my heavy brass compass, and my silver pen, aligning them with the meticulous precision of a solitary soldier preparing for a long siege. I set up my station, back to back with his. We were less than 5 feet apart, yet we faced completely opposite walls, cleanly touched by the invisible, unyielding barrier of our professional pride. The daily rhythm of our new lives settled into a guarded, highly competitive silence. We did not engage in forced domestic pleasantries. We did not eat breakfast together in the sprawling dining room. Nor did we ask how the other had slept. We simply worked. For hours on end, the only sounds in the grand library were the rhythmic scratching of carbon pencils against thick tracing paper, the soft rustle of large architectural blueprints being unrolled, and the distant, rhythmic crash of the ocean against the jagged cliffs below. The silence in the room was not empty. It had teeth. It was heavily filled with the weight of unsaid criticisms and constant mutual appraisal. It was a strange, incredibly tense intimacy. Sitting so close, I could hear the exact moment Julian encountered a difficult design flaw. His rapid pencil strokes was gradually slow, becoming heavy and deliberate against the paper. I knew exactly when he was satisfied with the solution. A moment marked by the sharp, decisive snap of his wooden ruler being set down against the table. I assumed he was equally aware of my own physical habits. He had to know that I tapped my heel against the hardwood floorboards when I was frustrated, or that I subconsciously held my breath when drawing a particularly delicate, sweeping archway. We were two fierce rivals mapping out our separate empires in the exact same room, sharing a profound, tactile awareness of each other that we absolutely refused to acknowledge aloud. By the second week, the damp chill in the library had seeped deep into my bones. I was intensely focused on working out a complex elevation for a municipal center, utilizing a heavy charcoal technique to map out the dramatic shadow plays along the building's massive facade. The carbon dust was incredibly thick, the pale afternoon light, filtering weakly through the high clerestory windows, illuminated the thick haze of dark particles suspended in the air. Every time I exhaled, the fine dust danced in the pale beams, a highly visible testament to my quiet, ongoing struggle. The dark powder coated my fingertips, smudged the cuffs of my sweater, and drifted relentlessly into the cold, stagnant air of the library. I coughed. It was a small, dry sound, instantly swallowed by the vastness of the stone room. I took a quick sip of lukewarm water from a chipped ceramic mug I had brought from my old apartment, desperately hoping the liquid would soothe the scratchiness in my throat. It didn't. A few minutes later, the abrasive dust settled deep in my throat again, and I coughed much harder, my chest tightening painfully against the drafty chill. I pressed my hand firmly to my mouth, deeply embarrassed by the physical disruption. I was fiercely determined not to show any sign of weakness in front of my competitor. I absolutely refused to be the fragile bride who could not handle the physical toll of her own demanding artistry. Directly behind me, the steady sound of Julian's pencil abruptly stopped. I froze in my chair, waiting for the inevitable reprimand, anticipating the sharp comment about my archaic drafting methods or my inability to maintain professional focus. The heavy silence stretched between us, tight and incredibly fragile. Then I heard the loud scrape of his wooden stool being pushed back. The heavy, measured footsteps of my husband crossed the wooden floorboards, moving decisively away from my desk. I did not turn around to watch him. I kept my eyes stubbornly fixed on my charcoal blueprint, my grip tightening on my pencil until my knuckles turned white. Julian walked to the far end of the library, his boots making heavy thuds against the thick woven rug. He moved purposefully towards the massive bay window, overlooking the treacherous cliffs. There was a loud, metallic clank as he unlatched the heavy iron lock holding the frame shut. With a firm, decisive push of his broad shoulders, he forced the large glass panes open, leaning his entire weight against the heavy wooden frame to clear the catch. Immediately, a massive rush of biting, salty sea air swept violently into the room. It was absolutely freezing, a gale that cut through my thin wool sweater like a physical blade. But the powerful cross breeze instantly caught the stagnant, choking charcoal dust. It pulled the dark haze entirely away from my desk and swept it out into the stormy afternoon. The air in my burning lungs cleared almost instantly. I took a deep, unobstructed breath, the sharp cold acting as a sudden shocking relief. Julian stood silently by the open window for a long moment, the aggressive wind tearing at the collar of his dark shirt and messing his usually immaculate hair. He looked out at the churning, violent water, his broad shoulders rising and falling in a slow, remarkably steady rhythm. "It is freezing," I whispered, the quiet words slipping out into the cold air before I could stop them. I hugged my arms tightly around my chest, shivering violently as the ambient temperature in the massive library plummeted. Julian turned his head slightly, his sharp profile outlined perfectly against the gray, stormy light. He did not look at me. "The radiators make the air too thick," he said, his voice completely flat, devoid of any emotional inflection or expected warmth. "I prefer the cold. It keeps the mind sharp." He slowly walked back to his cedarwood drafting table, sat down on his stool, and calmly picked up his pencil. He did not ask if I was feeling better. He did not demand any gratitude for clearing the air of the toxic dust that had been steadily choking me. Instead, he offered a cold, practical excuse that allowed me to keep my dignity entirely intact, pretending that his dramatic action was entirely selfish. I slowly uncrossed my arms and picked up my piece of charcoal. I stared at the blank corner of my tracing paper, the biting chill of the drafty room, suddenly feeling less like a punishment and more like a strange, intensely protective embrace. I realized then that my husband was a man who built formidable fortresses, not just out of stone, glass, and steel, but out of deliberate silence. He would never offer me a warm, comforting word. He would simply step into the freezing wind and tear the heavy windows open, ensuring I could finally breathe, all while claiming he only wanted a colder room. I dipped my head, returning to my intricate shadow work. The soft, rhythmic scratching of our pencils resumed in the quiet library, blending seamlessly with the sound of the ocean outside. For the first time since my father disappeared, as the freezing sea air wrapped around my shoulders, I did not feel entirely alone. The coastal fog of the Pacific Northwest does not simply arrive. It materializes slowly, swallowing the sharp edges of the world until only the immediate present remains. In the days following the sudden clearing of the choking charcoal dust, the atmosphere within the grand library subtly shifted. The heavy, oppressive silence that had defined our initial cohabitation began to soften. It was no longer a cold, competitive vacuum designed to suffocate, but a shared, quiet sanctuary where two deeply guarded artisans worked in tandem. We still did not speak of the weather, our pasts, or the massive corporate debts that had chained us together. We simply existed in the same breathing space, anchored by the rhythmic sound of our pencils against paper. By the third week, I found myself locked in a brutal intellectual struggle with a new municipal project. It was a cliffside gallery, a structure I desperately wanted to appear as a delicate glass crescent hovering effortlessly over the jagged rocks. But the physics refused to cooperate. The sheer tensile stress on the outward anchor points was dangerously high. For 3 consecutive nights, I sat at my scarred mahogany desk until the early hours of the morning, surrounded by crumpled tracing paper and the bitter dregs of cold ginger tea. I adamantly refused to insert a heavy brutalist steel column into the center of the viewing floor. It would completely ruin the aesthetic purity of the space, but without it, the building was fundamentally unsafe. Exhausted and thoroughly defeated, I had finally abandoned my workstation near dawn, leaving my intricate, flawed sketches spread haphazardly across the wood. My trusted drafting pen lay uncapped beside the chaotic web of erased graphite, a silent monument to my quiet frustration. When I returned to the drafty library later that morning, the pale, iron-colored light was already spilling across the floorboards. I walked toward my desk, fully prepared to scrap the entire concept and start over from the foundation. I stopped short. Lying across the delicate, translucent surface of my highest-grade vellum was a single, sharp, impeccably drawn line. It was not drawn in my dark graphite, nor my signature blue ink. It was drawn in bright, carmine wax. I set my warm mug down on the edge of the wood, my breath catching slightly in my throat. I leaned over the drafting surface, my eyes rapidly analyzing the brilliant geometric shift. The red line subtly repositioned the primary load-bearing fulcrum, pulling the center of gravity back into the bedrock by exactly 3 degrees. It was a microscopic spatial adjustment, but it instantly absorbed the massive structural tension without requiring a single visible support column. It preserved my aesthetic vision perfectly, while quietly ensuring the building would stand for a century. I looked across the room. Julian's massive cedarwood drafting table was empty, his own tools meticulously aligned. He used a carmine wax pencil for his initial structural markups. He had not left a patronizing sticky note of explanation. He had not signed his initials to claim intellectual credit for the salvation of the project. He had simply walked over to my desk in the dead of night, studied the chaotic labyrinth of my frustrated calculations, and quietly provided the exact mathematical anchor I needed to succeed. If my husband had wanted to assert his absolute corporate dominance, he would have done nothing. He would have allowed me to present the structurally flawed blueprint to the hostile board of directors. He would have watched the senior engineers tear my fragile design apart, proving once and for all that Vance architecture was a liability that needed to be fully absorbed into his empire. Instead, he chose to protect my professional dignity. He chose to save my independence without ever demanding a single word of gratitude in return. This story doesn't rush. It lingers in quiet rooms between unfinished words, in the spaces where love is found without being spoken. I slowly reached out, running my bare index finger over the bright red wax. I could feel the faint, deliberate indentation his heavy hand had left in the thick vellum. For a man constructed entirely of impenetrable winter stone, it was a breathtakingly gentle intervention. It was a silent vow that he would not let my foundation crack while he was standing in the same room. The heavy oak door of the library clicked open. Julian stepped into the room, carrying a stack of fresh structural reports. He wore a dark charcoal sweater, the sleeves pushed up to reveal his forearms, smelling faintly of cold rain and dark roasted coffee. He did not look toward my desk. He did not pause to gauge my reaction, or wait for a trembling, emotional thank you. Sometimes love doesn't knock, it waits. He simply walked to his cedarwood drafting table, sat down heavily on his wooden stool, and picked up his carbon pencil to begin his own morning work. I carefully capped my silver writing tool, my heart beating in a slow, entirely new rhythm. I sat down at my own desk, pulling a fresh sheet of vellum over the corrected drafts. We did not speak, but the silence between us had completely transformed. It was no longer a wall, it was a bridge. Some places don't wait to be found. They call to you in silence. Over the next month, the drafty, west-facing library evolved into exactly that kind of rare, unspoken refuge. But quiet sanctuaries are inherently fragile, perpetually vulnerable to the intrusion of those who do not understand their heavy reverence. That intrusion eventually arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, driving a low-slung silver sports car that sounded aggressively and synthetic against the steady, natural roar of the coastal tide. It was Marcus Thorne. Julian's younger brother was the charismatic public face of Thorne Industries, where Julian was a stoic, trauma-walled architect who preferred the isolated company of stone and steel. Marcus was a polished corporate diplomat. He smiled easily, wore impeccably tailored light gray suits, and spoke in a constant stream of warm, practiced platitudes. He had arrived at the remote coastal estate under the grand guise of celebrating our recent union, bringing expensive bottles of imported wine and loud, echoing laughter into the quiet halls. I did not trust him. I was a woman who spent her life observing microscopic structural defects, and Marcus's flawless warmth felt entirely like a manufactured veneer. It was too perfectly calibrated, lacking the heavy, grounded authenticity of his brother's cold silence. On Thursday afternoon, the coastal storm intensified. Julian was forced to step out onto the rain-swept terrace to handle a tense, escalating phone call with their restless board of directors. I remained in the library organizing my scattered trace paper, the hand-drawn master blueprints, the highly confidential, collaborative designs for our massive seaside development project had been meticulously stored away the night before. They were resting inside the locked archive room at the far end of the West Wing. Those raw, delicate sheets of vellum held the combined legacy of both our firms, vulnerable and entirely irreplaceable. The heavy air in the library felt stifling without Julian's quiet presence. I found myself unable to concentrate on the secondary elevations without verifying the soil load data. So I decided to retrieve a set of historical topographic maps from the archive. I walked softly down the long, shadowed corridor, the sound of the ocean muffled by the thick stone walls. As I approached the heavy oak door of the archive, a cold prickle of unease settled at the base of my neck. The heavy iron deadbolt, which Julian had secured himself just hours ago, was disengaged. The door was resting open by a fraction of an inch. I stopped, my hand hovering over the cold metal handle. The archive was a sacred space, meant only for the two of us. I pressed my palm flat against the heavy wood and pushed it open without making a sound. The room was dim, illuminated only by a single brass reading lamp suspended over the central viewing table. Spread wide across the massive mahogany surface were our hand-drawn master blueprints, exposed to the ambient light, and standing directly over them was Marcus. In the quiet, heavy silence of the stone room, I heard it. It was a faint, sharp, synthetic click. It was the unmistakable sound of a smartphone camera shutter, barely masked by the distant rhythmic crashing of the tide outside the narrow windows. I froze in the doorway, the chill of the corridor seeping into my bones. I was an architect. I spent my entire life analyzing spatial trajectories, weight distribution, and the natural mechanics of movement. The way his hand hovered over the delicate vellum, the precise angle of the lens, the deliberate, highly skilled bypass of the heavy iron lock. It was a calculated geometric intersection of theft. It was a flawless, surgical strike against our fragile foundation. Marcus turned his head, spotting me in the doorway. He did not flinch. His smartphone vanished smoothly into the inner breast pocket of his tailored jacket, the motion so fluid it was almost invisible. "Clara," Marcus said, his bright, flawless smile instantly blooming across his face, entirely too loud for the hushed acoustics of the archive. "I hope I'm not intruding." The door was slightly ajar, and I simply couldn't resist admiring the legendary Thorne archives. The texture of this vellum is remarkable. It's so archaic, yet so beautiful. I looked at his smiling face, then down at the master designs. They were perfectly aligned, exactly as Julian had left them, but they were no longer a secret. I did not scream. I did not hurl wild accusations across the quiet room or demand that he empty his pockets. That was the behavior of a helpless victim, and I refused to play that role. Instead, I stepped fully into the room, my heart turning into a cold, solid block of ice inside my chest. "The archive is a restricted area, Marcus," I said, my voice as flat and unyielding as winter stone. And the door was locked. He lingered for a moment longer, his eyes scanning my guarded, emotionless face, searching for a crack in my composure. When he found none, he offered a polite, deferential nod. "My apologies," he murmured, his polished diplomatic veneer never slipping. Even as the tension thickened between us, I'll leave you to your magnificent work." He brushed past me and exited the room, his paw leather shoes clicking sharply against the corridor floorboards until the sound faded completely into the ambient roar of the sea. I stood alone in the chilling silence of the archive room, staring down at the intricate lines Julian and I had drawn together. The absolute truth settled heavily over my shoulders. He had not come to the estate to celebrate our union. He had come to measure the cracks in our foundation, and to steal the very blueprints that were meant to save us. The true threat to our fragile, newly built empire did not come from a rival firm in a distant city. It came from the smiling brother, sleeping just down the hall. I did not run out into the shadowed corridor to chase the polished diplomat. I did not scream for my husband, nor did I hurl wild, desperate accusations into the echoing halls of the coastal stone mansion. I was a woman who had survived the absolute financial ruin of my father's gambling debts by learning to measure the exact structural integrity of every crisis before I reacted. Panic was a luxury I simply could not afford. Instead, I carefully locked the heavy iron deadbolt of the archive room, securing the compromised vellum with hands that barely trembled. I walked back to the drafty library and told Julian exactly what I had witnessed. He had not shouted. He had not stormed down the hall to violently confront his own blood. He had simply closed his eyes, the muscles in his sharp jaw tightening, absorbing the staggering betrayal with the terrifying, silent endurance of a load-bearing pillar taking on excessive weight. I spent the next 48 hours waiting for the invisible structural collapse. Every time a wooden floorboard creaked in the massive estate, I expected the authorities. Every time the wind howled against the glass, I expected the banks to call in our loans. Marcus Thorne left the estate the following morning, citing urgent corporate matters in the city. He offered a warm, lingering embrace to his stoic brother and a polite, chillingly hollow smile to me as his expensive leather luggage was loaded. Julian stood on the rain-swept terrace, his dark, impenetrable eyes tracking the low-slung silver sports car until it disappeared completely into the thick morning fog. I stood quietly beside him in the biting wind, the heavy knowledge of the breached archive room sitting like a cold stone in my throat. We knew the foundation was cracked. We just did not know when the building would finally fall. The detonation did not occur with a dramatic physical explosion, but with a series of quiet, synthetic digital chimes. It was a Tuesday morning. The relentless coastal storm had temporarily broken, leaving the rugged cliffs of the Pacific Northwest bathed in a pale, fragile sunlight that did little to warm the perpetually chilled library. Julian and I were working at our respective stations, in a state of hyper-focused vigilance. I was meticulously shading a complex elevation for the Seaside Cultural Center when the tablet computer resting on the corner of my scarred mahogany desk lit up. A sharp, dissonant ping echoed through the quiet room. Then, Julian's smartphone vibrated aggressively against the cedarwood table. A second later, the private estate line began to ring, a loud, intrusive, and demanding sound that completely shattered our quiet, analog sanctuary. I set down my heavy charcoal pencil, a deep primal sense of dread pooling in my stomach. I reached out and swiped the glass screen of the tablet. The display was instantly flooded with urgent media alerts, emergency board notifications, and flashing headlines from every major architectural publication on the continent. Our shared legacy, the highly confidential seaside development project that we had poured our souls into, was plastered across the digital feeds in glaring high resolution. But it was not credited to Thorne Industries or to my own struggling firm. The designs had been sold to our most vicious corporate rival, a massive international conglomerate notorious for stripping the unique soul out of artistic structures to maximize cheap, rapid construction. Worse than the intellectual theft was the poisonous narrative attached to it. Marcus had not simply leaked the designs for a quiet payout. He had orchestrated a complete, devastating character assassination. The aggressive headlines accused Clara Vance and Julian Thorne of fraudulent collusion. The articles claimed our sudden, highly publicized marriage was nothing more than a desperate, illegal corporate maneuver designed to cover up our respective impending bankruptcies by shamelessly plagiarizing the rival firm's existing intellectual property. I stared at the glowing screen, my chest tightening so violently I felt lightheaded. The digital images displayed perfect, algorithmic scans of our master blueprints. Every cantilevered terrace we had painstakingly debated. Every precise soil load calculation I had drafted. Every delicate archway Julian had refined in the cold silence of this room had been commodified and weaponized against us. My beloved drawing implement, the heavy silver instrument I had used to meticulously trace every line of that stolen design, sat uselessly beside the flashing tablet, completely powerless against a digital theft. My life's work, the only tangible proof of my competence, was being publicly dismantled and rebranded as stolen goods. Across the room, the heavy cedarwood drafting table groaned slightly as the billionaire architect slowly stood up. His massive frame blocked the weak sunlight, filtering through the clerestory windows, casting a long, dark shadow over the floorboards. He held his smartphone in his large hand, his grip so intense his knuckles were completely white against the dark metal casing. I watched the screen of his device glow dimly against the shadows of the room. A short text message from his brother was clearly visible on the illuminated display, cutting through the barrage of missed calls from panicked board members. It was a string of simple words that carried decades of toxic family history, deep-seated resentment, and manipulative cruelty. "This is how you pay me back," the message read. It was a staggering, deeply manipulative accusation, a masterclass in psychological warfare, from a brother who clearly felt entitled to the empire Julian had built from nothing. It implied a massive, unspoken debt that could never be settled, a twisted justification for tearing down our fragile sanctuary and ruining our professional lives. I sat frozen at my desk, waiting for the stoic man to finally fracture. I waited for the inevitable corporate rage, the loud shouting, the furious calls to his aggressive legal team to initiate a scorched earth defense against his own family. Julian did none of those things. His face remained an impenetrable mask of cold winter stone. With a slow, incredibly deliberate motion of his thumb, he quietly deleted the message. He did not draft a furious reply. He did not hurl the expensive device across the room in a physical tantrum. He simply placed the phone face down on the wooden surface, decisively severing the digital connection to his toxic bloodline. Then he walked slowly across the wide expanse of the library. He did not stop at his own desk to gather his thoughts. He bypassed the relentlessly estate-ringing phone entirely and came to stand directly in front of my mahogany desk. His broad shoulders completely eclipsed my view of the flashing tablet computer, physically shielding me from the relentless barrage of incoming media alerts, public accusations, and corporate panic. The heavy, suffocating silence in our workspace was profound. It was not the tense, competitive quiet of our early days, nor the peaceful stillness of our recent domestic truce. It was the heavy, breathless silence of a bomb shelter during an active siege. The outside corporate world was currently demanding that we turn on each other. The media expected the rival architects to tear up their transactional marriage contract, issue separate press releases, and point fingers to save their own individual reputations. But as I looked up into his dark, unyielding eyes, I saw absolutely no hesitation and no doubt. He did not demand an explanation. He did not question my loyalty, and I did not question his. The ambient roar of the coastal tide battered the thick glass of the bay window, a violent natural contrast to the artificial crisis unfolding on our screens. I inhaled slowly, pulling the grounding scents of cedarwood, old paper, and dark roasted coffee into my lungs. He was offering himself as a physical barrier between my fragile peace and the destruction his family had wrought. The devastating corporate betrayal had instantly burned away the last lingering remnants of our professional rivalry, leaving only the undeniable, terrifying truth that we were entirely alone and entirely aligned. The digital screens on my desk eventually went dark, transitioning into an eerie, blank standby mode that offered a stark contrast to the heavy, analog reality of the stone room. We did not succumb to the panic. We were architects. When a massive structure fails, you do not stand in the rubble and weep helplessly. You methodically trace the stress fractures back to the bedrock foundation to understand exactly why it collapsed. We were accustomed to solving impossible problems in quiet rooms, and this was simply the most dangerous equation we had ever faced. Bring the originals? Julian instructed, his voice a low resonant hum that vibrated comfortably in the center of my chest. It was the first time he had spoken since the media alerts began, and the steady, unwavering timbre of his tone was an incredible comfort against the chaos. I did not hesitate. I pushed my wooden chair back, walked to the secured cabinet, and unlocked the heavy brass latches of my protective portfolio. I carefully extracted the hand-drawn master blueprints. The thick sheets of premium vellum smelled of aged paper and faint traces of dried lavender, a stark, physical reminder of the countless quiet hours we had poured into their collaborative creation. I carried the fragile sheets to the exact center of the room, laying them flat across his expansive cedarwood drafting table. For the first time since I had arrived at the coastal mansion as a debt bride, we sat on the exact same side of the massive desk. There was no invisible barrier of professional pride separating our workspaces, no guarded distance left to maintain. Our shoulders nearly brushed as we leaned intimately over the delicate graphite lines, the shared, subtle heat of our bodies fighting back the perpetual, biting draft of the library. Julian reached into his top drawer and produced a heavy brass magnifying loupe. He did not hand it to me with an explanation. He simply placed it gently over the lower right quadrant of the primary structural elevation, stepping back just enough to allow me to look through the curved glass first. We were completely bypassing the generic, melodramatic misunderstandings that plagued lesser partnerships. We did not need tearful emotional pleas to prove our innocence to each other. We needed tangible physical evidence to prove it to the Architectural Ethics Board. Look closely at the shading on the cantilevered terrace, he murmured, his breath brushing softly against my temple. It was an incredibly intimate proximity, yet our focus was entirely grounded in the strict geometry of our mutual survival. I leaned down, peering through the thick lens, my highly trained eyes analyzing the magnified strokes of my own graphite. The digital leaks currently dominating the news feeds displayed perfectly smooth, uniform lines, the kind produced by a high-end algorithmic scanner attempting to rapidly replicate organic drafting. But beneath the brass lens, the absolute truth of our human imperfection was undeniably visible. "The pressure marks," I whispered, my heart giving a sharp, sudden jolt of adrenaline as the realization hit me. The digital scans completely flattened the physical topography of the paper. They successfully stole the visual image, but they couldn't steal the actual, physical depth of the charcoal. I carefully slid the brass instrument across the vellum, moving it toward a specific, highly complex intersection of load-bearing structural beams. It was the exact spot where he had quietly corrected my flawed design weeks ago, using his carmine wax pencil. The red wax had not entirely bonded with the surface of the vellum, in the way standard liquid ink would. It left microscopic, raised ridges across the page, a tactile testament to the heavy pressure of his hand. The stolen digital files currently circulating in the press showed those crucial lines as flat, standard red pixels. They entirely lacked the three-dimensional shadow and texture of the physical wax. "They don't have the wax," I said, looking up at him, the strategic realization washing over me like a warm, powerful tide. If they try to publicly claim they independently designed this structure, Evelyn Gray and the Ethics Board will demand to see the original physical drafts. The digital timestamp on their stolen files is easily manipulated, but they cannot possibly fake the physical indentation your hand left on my paper. Julian exhaled slowly, the broad, tense line of his shoulders dropping a fraction of an inch in the quiet room. He rested his large, ink-stained hands on the edge of the cedarwood table, his dark gaze fixed intently on the bright red correction that had once served as the first silent bridge between us. The very act of his quiet, anonymous care was now the exact piece of evidence that would save us both from absolute ruin. "He always hated the silence," Julian said quietly, the rare spoken words carrying the heavy, unbearable weight of a lifetime of familial grief. It was the most raw, vulnerable statement the stoic billionaire had ever offered me, a rare glimpse behind his walls of winter stone. Marcus thrives entirely in the noise. He lives for the constant validation of the corporate boardrooms, the flashing cameras, and the aggressive posturing of the press. He could never understand why I preferred the isolation of this estate, why I chose to work with raw wood and stone, instead of leveraging stock prices. He viewed my quietness as an insult to our father's loud, aggressive legacy. He leaked the designs not just to steal the company's valuation, but to force me out of my sanctuary. I listened to the raw, gravelly timbre of his voice, analyzing the deep, invisible cracks in his emotional armor. He was a man who had spent his entire adult life building impenetrable, beautiful fortresses to protect himself from the very people who shared his last name. His own brother had weaponized his guarded trust, viewing his quiet, protective nature as a vulnerability to be callously exploited for public gain. I looked down at his right hand resting on the table. His knuckles were faintly scarred, his long fingers heavily calloused from years of gripping heavy carbon pencils and carving architectural models out of raw wood. It was the strong, steady hand of a master artisan, a silent protector who had actively chosen to rebuild my confidence, rather than tear my reputation down when I was at my most vulnerable. I did not offer him a hollow, meaningless platitude about the complexity of family or the healing power of forgiveness. Words were entirely insufficient for the sheer magnitude of his brother's betrayal, and I knew he despised empty corporate rhetoric. Instead, I reached slowly across the few inches of space separating us and placed my palm firmly over his ink-stained fingers. Julian froze completely. The thick muscles in his forearm locked in sudden, absolute shock at the unexpected physical contact. I did not pull away. I kept my hand anchored securely over his, pressing my own living warmth into the cold, rough texture of his skin. It was a silent, unyielding vow, communicated in the only language he truly trusted. I was telling him, through the simple gravity of my touch, that I was not afraid of his silence, and I was absolutely not going to run from the ruins of his family's collapse. Slowly, the rigid, defensive tension in his hand began to dissolve. His long, thin fingers shifted slightly against the cedarwood, turning just enough so that the rough pads of his fingertips could brush against the sensitive skin of my palm. He did not pull me into a desperate, theatrical embrace, nor did he make a grand, dramatic declaration of love to combat the betrayal. He simply turned his hand over and held mine tightly against the edge of the drafting table, his grip heavy, anchoring, and profoundly safe. "Write the life you want," I murmured softly into the quiet space between us, my eyes tracing the delicate, intertwined architecture of our joined hands. "I'll meet you there." Julian closed his eyes, a ragged, unaccustomed breath finally aping the deep cage of his chest. The ambient roar of the coastal tide continued to batter the thick glass of the bay window, a violent natural storm raging relentlessly outside our heavy stone walls. But inside the drafty, west-facing library, amidst the terrifying threat of complete financial liquidation and public professional ruin, the heavy silence was finally broken by the undeniable, quiet warmth of absolute trust. We were going to war against his own bloodline, but for the first time in our fiercely independent lives, neither of us was going to have to fight alone. The drive from our misty coastal sanctuary back into the urban concrete jungle was long and profoundly silent. We sat side by side in the back of the town car, the rhythmic hum of the tires against wet asphalt serving as a steady heartbeat while the towering glass skyscrapers slowly swallowed the pale morning light. By the time we descended into the subterranean levels of the financial district, the transition from raw nature to sterile corporate warfare was complete. The private corporate arbitration room was a sterile, windowless vault buried deep within the city's bedrock. It smelled sharply of ozone, polished veneer, and the bitter, metallic scent of expensive, flavorless coffee that had been left to simmer for far too long on a side table. The environment was meticulously designed to intimidate. It felt like a pressurized cabin where multi-million-dollar legacies were routinely dismantled and quietly absorbed before lunch. Sitting at the head of the massive obsidian table was Dr. Evelyn Gray. She was the formidable chairperson of the Architectural Ethics Board, a stern, highly meticulous academic purist who possessed a legendary disdain for corporate posturing. She wore a pristine, severely tailored charcoal suit and carried an aura of absolute, uncompromising authority. She was a woman who valued raw physical evidence far above the most eloquent, highly funded legal rhetoric. Sitting directly across the wide expanse of the dark table was Marcus. The polished diplomat wore a flawless light gray suit that caught the artificial fluorescent lighting perfectly, appearing completely unaffected by the heavy, suffocating gravity of the room. He looked entirely at ease, projecting the manufactured, effortless warmth of a man who firmly believed he had already won the war. For the past 45 minutes, he had delivered a masterful, highly rehearsed presentation. He utilized a sleek remote to project flawlessly rendered algorithmic models onto the large digital displays mounted on the walls. He spun a seamless, captivating narrative, explaining how his independent design team had developed the revolutionary cliffside gallery concept from scratch. He spoke smoothly about geometric synergy and modern efficiency, subtly and gracefully implying that his older brother's failing firm had desperately attempted to steal the intellectual property to cover up their own impending bankruptcy. I sat in my heavy leather chair, my hands folded quietly in my lap, listening to his flawless synthetic lie. I analyzed the exact angle of his relaxed posture, the confident cadence of his voice, and the lack of any visible tension in his jaw. It was a terrifyingly good performance, entirely devoid of any natural human hesitation. If the ancient discipline of architecture were solely a matter of digital aesthetics and boardroom charisma, he would have successfully destroyed us both. But a building is not merely a pristine picture on a glowing screen. It is a massive physical entity that must bear crushing weight, endure violent weather, and survive the relentless, unforgiving pull of gravity. Architecture is the precise management of physical friction, a reality that cannot be algorithmically faked. I did not interrupt his smooth presentation. I did not raise my voice in a desperate plea for justice, nor did I slam my fists against the cold obsidian table in a theatrical display of righteous anger. I simply waited. Beside me, Julian sat entirely motionless, an immovable wall of dark winter stone. The stoic billionaire did not summon an aggressive team of corporate lawyers to shout down his brother's false claims. He did not speak a single word in my defense, refusing to diminish my agency in this room. He simply rested his large, ink-stained hands on the table, his broad shoulders completely relaxed, radiating a quiet, unyielding support. He respected my competence enough to step back and allow me to wield the sword I had forged with my own hands. When Marcus finally concluded his presentation with a warm, deferential nod, the room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. Evelyn Gray adjusted her silver-rimmed glasses, her sharp, assessing gaze sweeping slowly across the dark table until it locked directly onto my face. She did not ask if I had a rebuttal. She simply waited for me to prove my right to exist in her industry. I leaned forward slowly and unlatched the heavy brass locks of my protective leather portfolio. The sharp metallic clicks echoed loudly in the hushed vault, cutting through the lingering echoes of the polished diplomat's speech. I carefully extracted the hand-drawn master blueprints, treating the fragile sheets with the deep reverence of a historian, handling ancient relics. I unrolled the massive documents across the cold obsidian surface. The thick, premium vellum immediately released the faint, grounding sense of dried lavender and aged paper, a stark, organic intrusion into the highly sterile manufactured environment. I reached into my pocket and retrieved my vintage pen. I did not unscrew the cap to write, but simply placed the heavy silver instrument on the table beside the vellum, using the familiar weight of the metal to silently anchor my nerves. Digital drafting programs are remarkably efficient, Dr. Gray, I began, my voice quiet, steady, and carrying the precise, undeniable authority of a woman who had spent her entire life fighting for every inch of her professional dignity. They plot coordinates on a flattened plane, producing a pristine image that is entirely two-dimensional, entirely devoid of human friction. They are flawless, but human creation is inherently flawed, and it is within those physical flaws that the absolute truth of authorship resides. I reached into the secondary pocket of my portfolio and withdrew the optical tool. I slid the cold metal instrument smoothly across the polished table, stopping it exactly in front of the stern chairperson. I asked the board to examine the primary structural anchor points on this original physical draft. I stated calmly, gesturing toward the intricate web of graphite lines depicting the gallery's foundation. Evelyn Gray did not hesitate. The meticulous academic picked up the heavy brass magnifying loupe and leaned heavily over the table, pressing the curved glass directly against the surface of my translucent vellum. The silence in the room deepened, becoming so absolute that I could hear the faint, rhythmic ticking of the wall clock and the steady, grounding sound of my husband's breathing beside me. When a human hand utilizes a traditional steel drafting compass, I continued, my gaze fixed firmly on the chairperson's focused expression. The sharp metal point must physically pierce the paper to hold the radial center of the arch. It leaves a microscopic physical indentation in the raw fibers of the vellum. A digital scanner, like the specific high-resolution device used to covertly photograph these documents in our private archive last Thursday, merely captures the visual image of the graphite circle. It cannot possibly replicate the deep puncture wound left in the actual paper. Evelyn slowly slid the curved glass across the blueprint, tracing the sweeping curves of the cantilevered terrace until she reached the specific, highly complex intersection of the load-bearing structural beams. Furthermore, I added, my tone dropping to a quieter, heavier register that vibrated with the undeniable weight of the truth, the crucial structural corrections on this elevation were drawn using a carmine wax pencil. Under magnification, you will clearly observe the three-dimensional ridges of the red wax, resting physically above the graphite base. The stolen digital files currently presented by the opposing firm show those precise lines as a perfectly flat, uniform matrix of red pixels. But under this lens, you can clearly see the microscopic shadow cast by the physical wax ridges against the overhead light, a three-dimensional topography they could never duplicate digitally. They managed to steal the aesthetic picture of the architecture, Dr. Gray. But they absolutely do not possess the architecture itself. Evelyn studied the intricate lines beneath the heavy glass for a long, agonizing minute. The rhythmic, mechanical hum of the room's air conditioning seemed to amplify, filling the tense space with a low, droning vibration. Finally, the chairperson slowly straightened up and deliberately placed the inspection device back onto the obsidian table. She did not look at the glowing digital screens mounted on the walls. She turned her sharp, uncompromising gaze directly toward the younger brother. I slowly shifted my attention to observe the charismatic diplomat. For the first time since he had arrived at the coastal estate to systematically dismantle our lives, his flawless, practiced smile had completely vanished. The pristine mask of corporate invulnerability shattered into pieces, leaving behind only the pale, rigid panic of a man who suddenly realized he was trapped beneath a rapidly collapsing foundation. He opened his mouth, desperately searching for another smooth, highly articulated deflection to save his narrative. But the stern doctor raised a single unyielding hand to silence him. The physical evidence presented is entirely conclusive, Evelyn said, her voice cutting through the sterile air of the vault like a sharpened steel blade. The digital files are undeniably a secondary reproduction of this physical draft. The allegations of corporate fraud against Vance Architecture and Julian's firm are hereby dismissed with prejudice. This board will be initiating a formal, comprehensive ethics review of your team's acquisitions practices by the end of the business day. It was over. There was no dramatic strike of a wooden gavel, no triumphant cheering, and no loud, melodramatic vindication. The massive corporate war that had threatened to completely liquidate our futures ended in the quiet, undeniable reality of a simple indentation on a piece of paper. I carefully rolled up our fragile, hard-won legacy and secured the heavy brass latches of the leather portfolio. Julian slowly stood up from his chair. He did not look across the table at his brother. He did not offer a final, bitter word of anger or a hollow lecture on familial disappointment. He simply placed his heavy, ink-stained hand firmly on the small of my back, offering a silent, grounding touch of absolute devotion, and quietly guided me out of the suffocating vault. We pushed through the heavy revolving doors of the financial center and stepped out into the biting, damp, Pacific Northwest rain. The cool water washed over my face immediately, stripping away the lingering, bitter scent of office ozone and the metallic taste of adrenaline. The storm was quiet, a steady, rhythmic drumbeat against the concrete that grounded us back in the physical world. For a long moment, we just stood there beneath the gray sky, letting the cold rain soak into our coats, breathing the clean, heavy air together. The city rushed past us, a blur of umbrellas and distant sirens, but inside our shared silence there was only a profound, echoing peace. We officially merged our remaining assets, but we deliberately downscaled the massive operation. The liquidation process was a grueling labyrinth of legal filings and board negotiations, meticulously stripping away the excess of our former lives. We voluntarily withdrew from the aggressive international bidding wars, dismantling the bloated commercial divisions of Julian's massive firm and quietly closing the bankrupt shell of my father's legacy. The private investigators we retained confirmed he remained entirely untraceable, vanishing completely into the ether of his foreign debts, which finally allowed us to legally seal his estate and release the ghost that had forced our hands. Shedding those towering financial burdens felt like waking from a decade-long fever. We chose instead to focus our combined, quiet talents on a single, profoundly meaningful project located on the rugged coast of the Pacific Northwest, just a few miles south of our stone mansion. It was not a towering, gravity-defying skyscraper wrapped in cold, reflective glass meant to dominate a city skyline. It was a humble, beautifully designed community library, nestled deeply and respectfully into the natural bedrock of the small seaside town. It was intended to be a sanctuary of quiet learning and local history, constructed entirely with raw, sustainable materials that honored the surrounding environment, rather than seeking to commercially exploit it. 7 months after the heavy doors of the arbitration vault had closed, the crisp coastal autumn had settled firmly over the jagged cliffs. The afternoon air smelled sharply of cold salt spray, damp earth, and the grounding, deeply earthy scent of freshly cut cedarwood framing. The relentless winter storm season had not yet begun, leaving the vast sky a brilliant, melancholic shade of pale, washed-out gray. I stood near the edge of the deep foundation trench, wearing a thick, oversized wool coat to ward off the biting ocean wind. A few yards away, Julian was working diligently alongside the local masonry crew. The formidable billionaire architect had entirely abandoned his tailored charcoal suits and his sterile executive lifestyle. He wore heavy canvas work trousers and a faded thermal shirt, his broad, powerful shoulders moving with steady, rhythmic precision as he helped the crew lay the foundational courses of rough stone and clay. He was completely in his element, a master artisan who had finally found profound, lasting peace in the tactile physical reality of raw building materials. I stood quietly on the uneven ground and watched him measure a vertical plumb line, his darks focused entirely on the quiet, unyielding geometry of the humble structure. As I observed the careful, deliberate movements of his calloused hands, I realized exactly how much the internal landscape of my own heart had irrevocably changed. The man who had once been a terrifying wall of impenetrable winter stone across a sterile boardroom table was now the absolute, undeniable center of my gravity. The heavy, inherited debts of my father were completely gone, erased not just from the financial ledgers, but from the defensive architecture of my own mind. I was no longer a desperate piece of collateral, offered up to appease a restless board of directors. And I was no longer fighting a lonely, exhausting battle for my right to exist in the margins of someone else's blueprints. Julian wiped a thick smear of gray mortar from his heavy hands with a coarse rag and walked slowly over to where I was standing. The aggressive coastal wind ruffled his dark hair, carrying the rugged, honest scent of the churning sea and hard physical labor. He did not offer a grand, sweeping declaration to mark the successful completion of the library's foundational phase. He did not ask for praise or public recognition for privately funding the community project. Instead, he reached down into a worn wooden crate, resting near the toes of my heavy boots, and pulled out a single, heavy clay brick. He held the dense block out to me, his massive hands moving with an incredible, practiced gentleness. It was a primary cornerstone piece, the clay still slightly damp and cool to the touch, specifically meant to be placed at the central load-bearing intersection of the library's eastern reading room. I looked down at the rough, dark, red surface of the material, carved deeply and meticulously into the damp clay. Resting perfectly in the center of the block were two simple, intertwined initials, CV and JT, for the archive room, he murmured quietly, his voice a low, resonant hum that vibrated comfortably in the freezing coastal air. It was a quiet, profound acknowledgement of the sacred, locked space in our home where our fragile trust had been brutally tested and proven entirely unbreakable. It was not a hostile corporate acquisition. It was not a legal mandate enforced by hovering attorneys. It was an equal permanent integration of our names into the very bedrock of a building, specifically designed to protect quiet stories and preserve the truth. I reached out and took the heavy brick from his hands. The coarse, gritty texture of the raw clay grounded me completely in the present moment, anchoring my spirit to the earth. I looked up into his dark, unyielding eyes. The impenetrable, defensive frost that had once defined his guarded gaze was entirely gone, completely melted away and replaced by a deep, unwavering warmth that radiated pure emotional safety. I reached out with my free hand, my cold fingers brushing gently against the faint, familiar scar on his knuckles, silently tracing the physical history of his unyielding protection. He stepped closer, smoothly eliminating the remaining physical distance between us. His strong arm wrapped securely around my waist, pulling me firmly against the solid, comforting heat of his chest. I leaned my head against his broad shoulder, closing my eyes as the ambient roar of the coastal tide washed over us in a steady, hypnotic rhythm. There were no flashing press cameras documenting our embrace, no hovering legal teams calculating our liabilities, and no sterile typed contracts dictating the precise boundaries of our affection. There was only the quiet, profound safety of a lifelong partnership forged in the fires of absolute truth. The transactional agreement we had signed in the rain, all those months ago, had formally expired, quietly dissolving into the past, but neither of us had noticed its passing. We had willingly traded a piece of cold legal paper for a lifetime of shared, peaceful mornings, quiet cedarwood drafting tables, and the simple, daily choice to fiercely protect each other's peace. I had finally learned that a true foundation is never built with polished steel, cold marble, or vast corporate wealth. It is built entirely with the silent, consistent grace of a partner who chooses to stay and hold the beams steady when the walls begin to shake. Home isn't a place or a name, it's a person. If this quiet story found a safe harbor in your evening, please leave a like and subscribe to sit with us again.